Welcome to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions and our Sustainability Talk series. My name is David Hart. I'm the director here. It's great to have you with us. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nick Jacobs. Nick is an associate professor of government at Colby College. He's written a lot, 3 books, 3 outstanding books, as well as many scholarly papers and high-profile op-eds. It's all good stuff. But today I want to focus on the 2023 book he wrote with his colleague Daniel Shea, entitled The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place and the Disuniting of America. For me, it's one of the most important and thought-provoking books I've read in the last few years. It includes an in-depth analysis of voting patterns going all the way back to, I think, 1820 or so.
1824.
We're close. Oh my gosh, you didn't go back to 1820. Darn. As well as the largest national survey that has ever been done regarding rural perceptions, preferences, or views, etc. The insights in the rural voter are especially relevant to the Mitchell Center's work, where we strive to meet Maine communities where they are, to learn from them, and to explore ways we might be able to work together towards shared goals. Of course, there's no way that any book can substitute for spending time in rural communities that are such an important part of our state and our nation. But I'm convinced that the insights in this book can help all of us do a better job of understanding and supporting those vital communities. So please join me in welcoming Nick Jacobs to the Mitchell Center.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction. I appreciate it. I'll say at the get-go, I am a professor at Colby College. I'm also the director of a new center for public policy and undergraduate education at Colby. I've spent the last couple of months essentially just talking to people in groups across the state. Few have been as generous with their time and their insights and willingness to collaborate than the Mitchell Center. And David and I did not know each other until just a few months ago. And I'm very grateful to be here today at his invitation and to share a little bit of my work from this 2023 book, as well as a host of other projects that I continue to engage in on the subject of rural voting. But really our focus today is on distrust of expertise. I don't know if I'm going to rise to David's charge of figure it out, tell us how we overcome the problem of distrust. But what I want to do is reframe maybe some of the ways in which we think about distrust or mistrust of experts, how this gets politicized, how it gets channeled through our institutions in which that govern how we make collective decisions. And I mean, just to get right to it, when we're talking about distrust in rural communities, we are talking about a general widespread social phenomenon. So these are data coming from the General Social Survey run out of the University of Chicago, going all the way back until the 1970s. These sets of questions from 1972. This is net confidence in government. So sum up all the people that say they have confidence in government, presidency, Congress, the court, subtract all the people that don't. I'm going to geocode a lot of responses today by rural and urban. Happy to get into definitions and measurement clarification in the Q&A. But I mean, patterns are striking. So president has never been as trusted as it's mistrusted, but since the 1970s, competence has plummeted. Same in Congress, same in the Supreme Court. Nothing particularly striking about a rural-urban divide. We see similar patterns as it relates to our civic institutions. Trust in organized religion actually becoming negative within the last decade, more people distrusting it than trusting it. Trust in our education institutions, trust in our medical community, trust in journalists, rock bottom nationwide. And it's not just institutional mistrust, it's trust in one another. percent of people who agree, whether most people try to be helpful, dipping, ebbing and flowing, but barely a majority. A increasingly smaller and smaller number, especially bottoming out in rural communities, of whether or not you can trust most people generally. Increasingly believing that most people are not going to treat you fair. We are in a crisis of mistrust in this country, not just politically, but socially as well. In 2020, my colleague Dan and I tried to understand the ways in which this mistrust was manifesting quite literally in our own backyards. Dan lives in Mount Vernon, Maine. I live in Vassalboro, Maine. I'm originally from Virginia, taught in rural public high schools for a period of time. We didn't need data to inform our perceptions that our neighbors, our friends, were increasingly distrustful, not just towards government elites, increasingly to one another. Those who were new to the community, like myself. We were generally unsatisfied with prevailing accounts of this story of rural trust, and especially the ways in which it was that pattern of mistrust or skepticism towards elites was being used to help explain the rise of certain political figures like Donald Trump. So as David mentioned, we set out to do a few different things. One, we go all the way back to 1824 and are looking at voting returns. 1824 is for a presidential election. This is the year in which we tend to think it makes the most sense to begin the study of mass democracy in the United States, at least for the states that had presidential vote returns in 1824. And we couple this with the largest survey of rural voters ever conducted on the issue of rural voting. So 10,000 rural respondents from Gamble, Alaska to Lubec, Maine. But more important than just the sheer size of the response pool, questions that we wrote, questions informed by our own experience, questions that we think speak to these particular issues driving rural attitudes and partisanship. And I'll just give you the argument right away. We were very comfortable with the possibility that in doing all that work, one thing we call the rural-urban divide, this thing you see every 4 years on election night, big swaths of red with those little coastal areas of blue and maybe a few blue dots in between. Maybe we've been there before. Maybe historically, we've seen this story play out in American politics. The late 1800s and the populist revolt. The 1920s, kind of memorialized with the famous Scopes trial of Bryan versus Darragh, the new urbanite versus the old stodgy sort of conservative Christian. We didn't find that. I'll get to that in a minute. We were also comfortable with the idea that if we set out to really try to pick rural folks' minds, that maybe there was nothing distinctive about a rural way of being or a rural identity. That maybe that divide in partisanship that we see between rural and urban areas, maybe it was nothing more than a demographic composition effect. The fact that rural areas tend to be whiter, the fact that rural areas tend to be older, they tend to be poorer, and that is what explained this partisan divide. That's not what we found. What we found was that rural voters are different. Perhaps the biggest difference is that they themselves see themselves as distinctly different. They hold a particular identity, a social construct that groups themselves as an important force in American politics. And as I'm going to elaborate on for the next 30 minutes, this identity has some particular manifestations when it comes to thinking about the problem of political and social mistrust in contemporary American politics. So I'm going to go through, and the way I generally sort of structure a quick talk on a 500-page book is I'm just going to give you sort of the three quick highlights, right? The three questions I'm most commonly asked about rural politics. One, is this all about Donald Trump? Let's put that elephant in the room. Two, isn't this all just about poverty and sort of backlash from the losers of globalization, find themselves the losers in the modern economy? Three, isn't this sort of a redo of Thomas Frank's very famous and influential argument from the early 2000s that voters of a certain persuasion are duped, tricked into voting against their self-interest because they're usually got their eyes on some other prize. They're fooled into voting a certain way because they're scared of gay marriage or scared of immigrants. Why do you need this elaborate theory of place-based identity to explain it? And those three in isolation, but also in combination, tend to be the larger way in which we think about politics. So surprise, I'm going to try and refute each of those relatively quickly. First, is this all about Donald Trump? This is not surprising to most people that are in a talk on rural politics. The imagery that we have grown so accustomed to. This is the Trump house in rural Pennsylvania. Actually, I just learned when I gave this talk out at Stanford, Mo Fiorina, who's a very famous political scientist, this is his cousin's house. So this is right. This is the shrine to Donald Trump in the middle of rural Pennsylvania. It's also like this huge get out the vote mobilizer. But right, we've been led to believe through not one, not two, but four New York Times stories that this captures the way in which rural people are engaging with a particular personality. I don't deny that there is something unique about Donald Trump's gravitational pull on the electorate in 2016, 2020, 2024. But this is where the historical data give us some insights. So here are Dan and my historical elections data. So this is at the county level, going all the way back to 1824. And essentially, we're just summing up the votes. We're saying this is a rural county, this is an urban county. That's very difficult to do. I'm going to stay at my podium, I've been warned. That's very difficult to do. And when most of this country is rural, we become a majority urban nation by most everyone's standard definition in 1920. But you can still do it, right? Even the great urban evil cities of Philadelphia in the 1790s, which could have fit entirely within the Eagles Stadium currently population-wise, saw themselves as an urban populace, a mercantile populace. But here's the rub. We see lots of variation in Democratic support. We use the Democratic Party since they're the longer history of the two. But it tends to go up and down together. Urban people voting against the Democratic candidate, rural people voting against the Democratic candidate. We have many divides in our political history, but they're largely sectional or regional or class-based. They are not an urban and rural divide. Let me visualize it one other way. If instead of just looking at the raw vote total, and instead we look at how much the Democrat over or underperformed in a particular area. So if a Democrat got 55, 57% of the vote, how much more or less did these areas on average give to that Democrat? We get a map like this, where the zero is they performed as expected. Mondale loses, but Mondale loses everywhere. Plummets in support, it's still at a zero so long as everybody's sort of turning out against Mondale as much as they should on average, given the national trend. Notice what begins in 1980 when it comes to expected support for the Democratic candidate. It falls, then it falls again, then it falls again and again. And if you were to draw a linear line between 1980 and 2024 and 2016, the losses that the Democratic Party has incurred in rural communities is almost linear. And Donald Trump's overperformance in rural communities in 2016 is only about 3 points more than what it should have been, given the Democrats' consistent underperformance. Now, Donald Trump is no Mitt Romney. There were no Mitt Romney flags being flown off the back of pickup trucks in 2012. But to tell me that this is a phenomenon that's solely attributable to a single candidate is to miss decades worth of history and institutional or communal memory about who's with us and who's against us when it comes to the two major political parties. So, it's not all Donald Trump. Maybe this is all about rural poverty, the losers of globalization, the victims of free trade deals. Let me complicate that one way at the get-go. Like I mentioned, we have lots of divides in this country politically. Often when we think about these divides at a national level, we'll talk about gaps, a gender gap, an education gap. The fact that women, for instance, are about 6-7 points more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate on average than men, or for the education gap, those with a college degree are increasingly way more likely to vote for a Democrat than a Republican. These demographic gaps go away in rural communities. If we look at the 2020 elections, because the 2024 data are still coming out for us political scientists, and I need to update it. But if we look at the 2020 data, and you look at just rural residents, those that made below $40,000, those that made above $90,000, that's a pretty big income gap. That does explain partisan differences nationwide. It doesn't tell you anything about support for the candidates in rural communities. A college degree kind of does, right? Almost 80, so 75% of rural residents in 2020 without a college degree voted for Donald Trump. But nearly 2/3 of those with a college degree did too. That college gap shrinks. Same with unemployed and employed, same with incomes. Last year did not increase, right? We think that the most important question to ask somebody in predicting how they're going to vote is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And your answer to that question helps us understand your relationship to the incumbent. Or James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. These explanations do not give us predictive value in rural communities. One that I'm not going to visualize here, but that you might be aware of, going back to the gender gap. On average, women nationwide are more likely to vote for the Democrat. Not true in rural communities. In the last 3 elections, rural women were a little bit more likely to vote for Donald Trump. So these standard demographics failed the test. Now, that's not to say that rural America has not suffered the brunt of our most recent economic changes or catastrophes, right? If we look at some data, this is OMB classifications of major cities, think New York, small cities, like Portland, and medium cities in between, and then rural areas everywhere else. We just look at the number of jobs in these communities. We look at the percent increase and decrease in the number of jobs over time. Right? 2008 financial recession hits, everybody suffers. Rural suffers more. Places begin to bounce back, rural still lags behind. In fact, by the time the next big economic shock, this isn't talking about China or a WTO ruling as just sort of basic structural components of the national economy. The next time we see a big shock with the COVID-19 pandemic, rural areas haven't even recovered the jobs they lost a decade earlier from the recession. And then they get hammered harder than everywhere else and still haven't caught up to that. So there is something there. But you and I know most people don't walk around with line graphs in the back of their head thinking about how the world works. We tell ourselves stories about how the world works, narratives about why it is there's limited opportunity, why it is that it seems like some places are moving ahead while others are falling behind. An important part of the rural narrative is that instead of just thinking about how oneself is doing economically, we find consistently that rural individuals are more likely to think about their community. In other words, go back to that question we would always ask, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? In rural communities, the question that helps us understand how somebody's going to vote, it's not whether you are better off, but whether your community is better off than it was 4 years ago. This general disposition to thinking about the well-being of your community, whether kids are going to have to move away, whether people are looking down on a way of life in your area, whether or not government listens to you, whether or not just people who live outside the community understand the importance. This last question here, in which only 8% of rural respondents agreed with the idea that people from cities think that rural areas are important. Just that simple statement. That comes from the American National Election Studies, and I sort of love it for its bluntness. It's not that people living outside of rural communities don't often think this too. It's not that people living in cities don't often think about kids moving away from that community in order to live productive lives when they get older. But it reaches a tipping point in rural communities that it begins to define the political ethos of that community. And it's happening everywhere. It's happening in rural communities that, quite frankly, are doing kind of okay. It's happening in rural communities that aren't. One of the reasons we think this is happening, and I wanted to elaborate on this a little bit more than I usually do, because I think it would be of particular interest to this group. And this, it's not conjecture in the book, but I think it's definitely something worthy of more systematic inquiry and study into how this is reinforced. Like, why are wealthy people in rural communities feel that sort of linked fate with non-wealthy people? Empirically, one of the things you may already notice if you live or work in a rural community is that rural communities are vastly more integrated socially and economically than other types of communities in the United States. So we can measure this a variety of ways. We can measure it using something called a dissimilarity index, which is essentially like the percent, take a community, and we do this at multiple levels, like a town, county, a CBSA, whatever, it always comes back the same. What percentage of individuals would you have to pick up and physically relocate so that they were all living next to people in proportion to that community's actual distribution? And rural, their dissimilarity is always not just a little lower, but vastly lower than it is in other types of communities. I think about the road I live on. The nicest house on the road, which ain't mine, the nicest house on the road is right across the street from the least nice house, so least nice, like they just got that final sheet of metal roof up from like 3 years ago. Their kids go to the same schools, they go to the same town dump, they drive on the same pot-filled road. There's a consistent experience in how they see the world, and I think in how they see one another. And that begins to transcend all these other markers or group affiliations that we see as important structures of American politics. We hit it over the head. What we don't see are the common stories about the culture wars being raged in rural America as it relates to our more urbane and progressive cosmopolitan urban America. This isn't the land of fanatical abortion restrictions. This isn't the land of opposition to police reform, right? You see some important differences, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there aren't any. The biggest differences, this should probably come as no surprise to my main audience, biggest differences dealing with the politics of gun control. These gaps are not, first off, nearly as large as the gaps in partisanship. It's at a policy level, we see a lot more agreement than we do when it comes to voting for individual candidates. Nor are these absolute values so far off on the extremes that I think it's fair to paint rural people as they are often painted, which are somehow policy extremists. Finally, and quickly, let me get to this question of maybe rural voters are just voting against their self-interest. Part of me thinks that this is just a 200-year-old stereotype and redo. They didn't go to college, they don't read the newspaper, all they care is about right? This is just the stereotype dressing itself up as some sort of fancy political argument. But as I mentioned, Thomas Frank gives us this argument in the mid-2000s. It's not going away. Just this past spring, that's not Jacobs, I'm sorry, there's Jacob Hacker. I put the S on there for obvious reasons. Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson writing about all the evil things Republicans are doing. I'm not going to really evaluate that, but they're doing it. And in order to do it, in order to get away with it, they have to stoke populist backlash, right? That's how they get into power, is by stoking backlash. And then once they're in power, they get to do whatever they want. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't hold a grain of truth. When you look at something like where the money is going, take the two largest spending programs from the federal government under the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the CHIPS investments. I recognize, I do this somewhat deliberately, that this is a very poor proxy, but it is a proxy nevertheless. And you look at where those monies are going in both amount, large circle, small circle, and then by the margin of vote in the 2020 presidential election. These monies are going disproportionately to red districts, a fraction of which are rural. And they tend to have a pattern that the more red you are, which does correlate pretty strongly with rurality, the larger the degree of investment. And that's by design. A lot of the underlying distribution rules in these programs was to give out disproportionate dollars to communities that had suffered the largest losses in wages and employment since early 2000s. And rural falls within that, particularly in manufacturing, which accounts for most of this country's manufacturing capacity in rural areas. The problem is that rural people don't see it. I think they have a good reason not to see it. At least they tell me reasons that make sense, even if I don't personally agree with it. One, when you just ask them about these policies, here we'll take infrastructure, and we'll take everybody's favorite broadband internet. The first thing you notice is they're not like over the top supportive. They don't see these things as the most critical needs to their community. I think that's a challenge to policymakers that do see these as critical needs. I'm simply just pointing out a disconnect between the ways in which politicians of one particular party like to tell themselves about all the good they're doing for people that don't actually see it as the most pressing issue in the community. But the second problem just has to do with implementation. When we ask people about whether or not they've heard of these commitments, they haven't. Some of that might be a function of media, but some of it is just a function of geography. Going back to this map, in urban communities, 90% of cities, so think of just like how this gets communicated out, like Portland is getting a new a grant, or New York City is getting this. 90% of urban communities will have received some money. And even though a disproportionate amount of those monies is going to go to a rural community, 5% of rural communities will. It's just, that's just a weird little quirk of political geography. So I think it's reasonable why people haven't heard, why rural communities haven't heard of this spending. Because even if it is going disproportionately, it's not going everywhere. But the more important one, and the one that comes back to our sort of discussion here today, that when they do tell me what they think about this money, when I ask, why do you think this is not very important? They think that it's because most of that money that comes into their community, it's actually not to benefit them. It's to benefit somebody else. That the only reason investment comes into our community is not for our needs, but for somebody else's. Nearly 2/3 of rural residents to say that. They tell me that when the federal government does something, they do it with bad intentions, almost twice as frequently as not rural residents. And that even when if the federal government had good intentions, nearly over 2/3 say, simply by acting, by spending that money, they're just going to make things worse. Yeah. So I think we all in the back of our heads have our own examples that we could maybe bring to the conversation as to why that makes sense. And sort of the funny thing in my work is I'm talking, and I've spent the last 30 minutes thinking about rural America as this like abstract national thing, and it's not. It's real places on the ground. And a lot of the politics is motivated by those local stories, those local histories of who's winning and who's losing. It's just happening everywhere that it's manifesting at the national level. And when I travel around the country, when I talk to elected officials, when I talk to town leaders, community organizers, they all have a different version of the same story. They all have a story about waiting for broadband, waiting decades for broadband. And so you open up a newspaper and you hear about $42 billion. Or now they took equity out, so it's just a bad program. Probably actually summarizes it well. Because none of that money, some of it has now been dispersed, but it has only been dispersed within the last couple of months. It's taken them years, planning and time and bureaucratic backlogs to get that money. And as some of the reporting done actually in our own state of Maine has shown from folks at the Daily Yonder, sometimes that's crowded out community-oriented solutions to figuring out broadband access so that telecom companies can get in there first, but I'm sure there's somebody in the audience that knows more about that than I. I can't travel to, I don't know why there's so many wolves in that picture, but I can't travel to northern Minnesota and Wisconsin without hearing about the reintroduction of wolves. And not just disagreement on the ends of that conservation policy, but the ways in which it was done. And the ways in which communities that now are sleeping with the wolves feel like they were mistreated by decision makers. Or we can look, and now they've doubled the estimate, but I'm just going to put the good faith $7.86 billion grant from the CHIPS Act to build a plant in rural Ohio. That Intel has already told us that because of years of underfunding of local schools, most of the people in that community will not be qualified for the jobs at that plant. I'm gonna close with this. You may have heard too that not only are rural people maybe duped, Trump obsessed, and just too poor to know what's good for them. You might also have heard that they're a threat to American democracy. This was the title, or it was the subtitle of the New York Times bestseller from the early 2024 campaign. I get that survey respondents don't responses don't help us identify real threats, but they do help us get a sense, I think, for how potentially extreme out there groups of individuals are. I don't see it in the data. But more importantly, I'm going to conclude that not only do I not see it, but I just think it is such a problematic way of understanding the political realities of this rural and urban divide. When you see the divide and when you see people as the threat and what people believe is the threat, you can brush them off. You can look at their mistrust of mainstream media or higher education officials. You can say, well, they're not to blame. We didn't do it. And what I just want to leave you with, because David sort of did give me a chart and say, kind of, can you leave on a note of telling us, like, what can we do? That we need to stop personalizing this idea that a certain group of citizens is what's tearing this country apart. That behind each of these patterns is not just a bunch of bad individuals, but what I'd argue are a bunch of bad systems that exacerbate our natural tendency to divide into us versus them. And so, if I may, my sort of 3 points, the things that I try to do, that I don't always even do successfully. I often think about what I do in the classroom. And the example that I see in the classroom most, and probably you do too, is, well, why do these communities that are at the front lines of climate change, why are they the least likely to say that they believe? I think that's a puzzle. I try to teach it as a puzzle with a deep history, with conflicted meanings. Most of the time, as I find, my colleagues, if I may, my students walking in, their instincts is to just say, well, that's just a lack of information. And if there's one thing I see throughout all my data that help, and my just living in rural areas helps me think about my time in the classroom, it's that not every problem is about an information deficit. Right? And so I try to think about the ways in which I unpack these stories. Follow the science as a bumper sticker, not a pedagogy. I think we need to do a better job of engaging our students into that lived experience, even as people that believe very fully in the scientific findings that inform our work. In our research, and I mean, this is sort of unfair because it's such a broad generalization, and I'm very aware that it is probably untrue of most of the people that come to a sustainability talk at the Mitchell Center. Right, these issues of sustainability are not divorced from politics and society. I can't give you my example because I just realized I'm being recorded and it's going to be posted and I don't want, but right, how many colleagues do you know that, again, speak about the findings of their work or speak about a problem or think about policy developments like the removal of these 4 dams and only think about it from a particular worldview or a particular position of what I frankly might often call privilege, without thinking about the larger political and social consequences and almost in a refusal to engage in those questions. And finally, and this is the one that I struggle with the most because I'm often thinking about it in the terms of organized political life, like telling elected officials to do this, which sounds silly. Like, what does a politics of reconciliation look like? A bit more bluntly, like, what does a politics of apology look like? How do you say I'm sorry? How do you say we didn't always have the right answer or the right solution or that you were left behind? I think that's something that not just elected officials struggle with, but maybe land grant institutions that have histories of doing work with the quote unquote winners of industrial and agricultural change. But I do think it's possible. I think it has to start with not viewing people as the evil thing in our politics, but systems and institutions, and that's where we need to focus our energies. But with that, I'd love to just turn. I always end on a happy note, which is my 2 little beautiful boys in the garden. So with that, I just turn to questions and answers. And if we don't get to your question, by all means, please feel free to email me. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
I have to talk into a mic or something?
No, we were in the ceiling.
Oh,
We're
high tech.
Here, being heard by a greater power.
Okay, well, thank you for that talk. It was very interesting. A lot of it was focused on the federal level, and I was wondering if you felt comfortable talking a bit about how some of these patterns that you showed either change or don't change if you look at like state, county, municipal, like government initiatives or attitudes towards those governance at those levels.
I love that question. I'm writing a paper right now on that. There's a few different ways, and I'll try to explain it. There's almost like a curvilinear relationship, which is almost exactly what social science theory predicts. At first, and this is somewhat surprising given a lot of work in political science and sort of attitudes on federalism and the citizens' ability to sort of distinguish between the mess of governments that they find themselves in. Turns out, like when you ask the question the right way and you sort of explore it, especially through this prism of understanding distrust, there is a lot of variation in how rural communities think about this question of states versus federal versus they are making distinctions, which is more than what most mainstream political scientists think the American public is capable of doing. We find, and this is unpublished, so I'll just throw that out there. It's working its way to publication. We find that rural populations in overwhelmingly urban states, where there is a not just disproportionately large, so like 5% of California is rural, but there is an enormous urban population as well. So it's very large and it's balanced. There's a lot of mistrust towards generalized devolution, right? So in Europe, so being floated around right now in European circles, because Europe is facing like this deep crisis of geographic mistrust as well between rural and urban areas. It's like sort of viewed as the just like stop kicking it all to Brussels argument. Devolve, devolve, devolve. And the implication of this finding is that no, I mean, rural communities in a federal system often find themselves as isolated political minorities in the states. Curiously, you go to a state like Maine, which is our second most rural state, we don't find sort of, it's not a linear pattern. We also see profound mistrust in the state institutions, even though in sort of the raw political logic of that, rural peoples are a majority. And some of our thinking there is that, you know, even in a state like Maine, which by census estimates comes close around 60% rural, right, it's not a monolith. Downstate rural Maine is very different from upstate rural Maine. Both kind of get grouped though into our figures. And what it does is it increases the salience of change and outcome. It's these sort of states in the middle, and I think there's a regional component to this as well, because a lot of those like Kentucky and Tennessee, like in the 40%, where rural communities aren't a political majority, but they're an outsized presence in the politics of their state, that tend to be more trusting of their states. And then again, on some like generic questions, more trusting towards devolution. You know, those are the general trends. I think we all have, again, the anecdotes that fit the data pattern as to why that might be in Maine, why that might be not in other communities as well.
I realize it's early days, so maybe this is future work, but are you asking any questions about maybe how people's perceptions of the services that governmental departments, agencies play now that so much gutting and defunding has gone on?
So it's very early work. I don't think anybody who really wants to know the answer to that question has asked the right set of questions. There's a lot of leading questions out there. What do you think of Elon Musk? What do you think of Doge? And the partisans will always come home. People are very good at knowing how they should answer surveys. So we've tried to get at that a little bit, and I wish I had a little bit more time to go back to the numbers, and be happy to share data if this is something we work on and talk about. But please, let's chat. You know, we've asked about Medicaid cuts. Right? It's very clear that again in a survey on Medicaid cuts, people are not supportive of that. You ask about the loss of services. People are a little bit more ambivalent on what loss of services means. Like, I don't think we were out in the field in the summer. It hadn't really, at least by people's perceptions and reported experiences, they hadn't felt a change necessarily yet. But I think you're right that this is just the very early days. So even with something like the big Medicaid cuts that we know are coming, we haven't seen the predicted fallout of that yet. We haven't seen, I guess, you know, spirit of my like we haven't seen what the potential band-aid to that cut, this rural hospital fund, whether or not that's going to some skepticism. What I also keep in mind when I look at questions like that is what are the sort of two worlds that people are thinking about? Right? There is the world in which there is policy change. you can ask them about policy change. And you say, what's your opinion on, the Republican plan to cut X amount of dollars from Medicaid? What's your opinion on the Affordable Act Care, losing subsidies on that? And I think, and this is mostly from conversation with folks, what's the alternative? And one of the things that I experience when I talk to people is, yeah, I don't support that. I don't want to lose Medicaid. I don't want somebody that I feel needs Medicaid to lose it. But what's the alternative that's being? The system that I'm in isn't working great. The system I'm in isn't delivering me world-class healthcare. The insurance marketplace that I'm increasingly paying more and more year after year isn't solving the problem of costs that they said that they would. So I think about sort of these two realities that both can be true. And I don't have a good way of measuring that with these types of methodologies.
Question from the chat.
Virtual.
So someone was wondering about the role of philanthropy in rural communities. You've talked a lot about sort of the failures of certain state level and federal level investment. I guess I'm thinking maybe with regards to religious institutions or sort of those big disparities in income inequality you see in rural communities. What is the role of philanthropy? How might it be different than these government programs?
Yeah, admittedly, I did not know much about these divides until I started doing some talks on the book, and I've had the pleasure of meeting folks out at different Ford Foundation that's doing excellent work in the state of Oregon, some philanthropy conference in the Northwest, and so I'll just sort of reiterate something that I'm told by a lot of these philanthropic groups that I speak with. Right, there is absolutely a divide. There's a divide in how the funders to these funding mechanisms understand or prioritize rural needs versus non-rural needs. Right, that we can, and I think Maine is exceptional in this regard. Right, but it is exceptional in a way that benefits and builds relationships across our rural and urban divide, but that doesn't mean that it's true everywhere else. And so what I really take away from my conversation with philanthropic groups, and then again, the Ford Foundation, I think, has been really excellent at doing this, sort of recognizing that it hasn't been a priority. When we think about poverty, we tend to urbanize. When we think about access to medical care, we think about it in broad strokes, and it doesn't always, those models don't always work in rural communities. So I've also recall seeing some very similar trend lines to those that I showed you about general employment. And when you look at sort of the rise and fall of philanthropic dollars that flow, it always slows down fastest in rural areas first. And then finally, the other thing I'll say on that question is that our political misframing of it, I think, viewing rural people as the problem, not rural institutions, is really, really problematic. It drives funders away. Not that conservatives aren't philanthropic, especially through other types of, when we think about NGOs that we most often come into conflict with, it's clear that there's a partisan bent to that.
I'm curious about your second point of action surrounding research and engaging in lived experience. And I'm curious if you could speak about whether or not that was part of Rural Voter Project, or if that's been part of any of your other projects, and sort of how you might see qualitative data coming into the scene of political science, and if that's possible in certain ways with this.
Yeah, so I love this. I've been writing about rural politics since before Donald Trump. Mostly because I teamed up with other scholars. We're a minority that are from rural areas that care about rural communities, trying to think about their politics. But I couldn't do my work. I would never have written this book. Dan would never have written this book with me unless qualitative research was out there first, contextualizing, exploring, and I will give all credit where credit is due to my colleagues like Kathy Kramer at Madison, Wisconsin, who wrote about rural resentment in the context of Wisconsin. Arlie Hochschild, who's a rural sociologist, excellent rural sociologist here. And like, I'll be totally blunt, like I get invited to talks because I have numbers. Numbers are one way in which a lot of people think about the world, especially survey results. And it is not the only way to think about the world. I would never get those. And even when I think about how I get those numbers, how many times did I say today, you know, it's because of who I talk to in my neighborhood. It's where my kids go to school, who I know. I think that's all a part of being a good social scientist. I learned that. I'll close on this because I know David runs a tight ship. It was drilled into me from the very beginning that the fundamental problem of social science is that we are embedded in the same phenomenon that we purport to study, right? There are no petri dishes. That's why it's harder to be a social scientist than a hard scientist. I think there's ways in which you can embrace the embeddedness. I am not. Yeah. You can embrace the embeddedness without sacrificing objectivity. And so that would be my sort of charge to you. Talk to some people. Surprising the number of social scientists that don't talk.
Well, I think there's some questions left in the room that maybe people can come up, but I want to thank Nick one more time for a really amazing set of work and a great talk.
Thank you so much.